The night air on the balcony of the Bellassini estate smelled of jasmine and old money. Below, the party hummed with the quiet laughter of dangerous people who had learned to smile without warmth. But up here, above all of it, Matteo Bellassini stood with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, watching the city lights blink like they owed him something. He hadn't meant to end up alone with her. He hadn't meant for any of this. But she had said something, quietly, almost to herself, and his entire world had stopped rotating. He turned to look at her properly. She was looking away, her chestnut hair catching the wind, her hazel eyes fixed somewhere distant and private. And the question left his mouth before he could cage it. "You've never been touched?" She didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, something in Matteo Bellassini, a man who had built his empire on never being surprised, froze completely. Before we go further, if this story already has you feeling something, please like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps this channel grow, and there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Now, let's go back to the beginning. It had started 3 weeks earlier, in a room full of music that no one was actually listening to. The Bellassini family held an annual charity gala every October at Villa Serena, a sprawling marble estate on the outskirts of Rome. 1,200 guests, 8 security personnel per floor, catered by the finest hands in the city. And at the center of the grand salon, positioned beside a Steinway concert grand piano, a young woman who had been hired to play background music for people who would never once stop talking long enough to hear her. Celeste Morelli had known this when she accepted the booking. She had taken the job because it paid well, because her student loan debt didn't care about artistic pride, and because her friend Gianna had convinced her that playing at a Bellassini event would look exceptional on her professional profile. "They know everyone," Gianna had said. "You play one song in front of the right person and your life changes." Celeste had smiled politely and said nothing. She didn't believe in lives changing from single moments. She believed in practice, discipline, and quiet persistence. She believed in the kind of progress that no one noticed until it was already complete. She sat down at the piano at 8 o'clock exactly, arranged her hands over the keys, and began to play. The room kept talking. Crystal glasses chimed. Silk dresses rustled. Someone near the window laughed too loudly at something that wasn't funny. The music moved beneath all of it like a river nobody looked at. Present, constant, invisible. Celeste didn't mind. She was used to being invisible. She played Chopin first, then Debussy, then a piece she had composed herself, something she had never performed publicly before, something so quietly personal that she almost stopped midway through it. But she didn't stop. She let it move through her fingers and out into the indifferent air, and she kept her eyes low and her breathing steady and her face composed. And she didn't notice the man who had stopped talking. She didn't notice him until the song ended. The applause from the room was perfunctory, scattered and polite, the kind people offer when they realize something has finished and manners require acknowledgement. But beneath that sound, in the brief pocket of silence just before the room resumed its noise, Celeste heard something different. Nothing. A specific, weighted nothing from a specific direction. She looked up. He was standing near the far wall, apart from the nearest cluster of guests by at least 8 feet, which in a room this crowded was a statement in itself. Tall, lean, dressed in a dark charcoal suit with the collar just slightly open, and he was watching her with gray eyes that didn't move away when she caught them. Most people looked away when caught staring. He didn't. He simply held her gaze for 3 full seconds, his expression revealing nothing, and then turned slowly back to the conversation someone was forcing on him. Celeste looked back at the piano keys. Her heart was doing something unreasonable. She had no idea who he was. She found out 20 minutes later when Gianna appeared at her elbow during her break, practically vibrating. "Celeste, do you know who was watching you play?" "Someone was watching me play?" "Matteo Bellassini." Gianna said it the way people said earthquake or storm warning, not with excitement exactly, but with the awareness that something powerful was present and close. "He's the one hosting tonight. He almost never attends these events personally. And he was watching you for the entire last piece." Celeste glanced in the direction she had looked before. The man with the gray eyes was now deep in conversation with two older men in dark suits. His expression controlled and unreadable. Even from a distance, there was something about the way the room organized itself around him. A subtle gravitational pull, people subtly angling their bodies toward him even when they weren't speaking to him, security personnel tracking him without appearing to. "He's the head of the Bellassini family?" Celeste asked carefully. "Yes." Gianna touched her arm. "Don't make eye contact again. Just play beautifully and accept the next booking. That's all we need from tonight." Celeste nodded. She went back to the piano. She made the mistake of looking up one more time. He was watching her again. And this time he didn't look away at all. The event ended at midnight. Celeste was packing the sheet music she had brought. Unnecessary but habitual, when someone appeared beside her. Not Gianna. Not the event coordinator. One of the security men, broad-shouldered and polite in the particular way that suggested he had been trained to be polite the way other people were trained to break bones. "Mr. Bellassini would like to offer his compliments," the man said. "If you have a moment." It wasn't really a question. Celeste understood that, but she made herself pause anyway, made herself consider the exit route, the distance to Gianna, the fact that she was in a very public room with hundreds of witnesses still milling about. She wasn't naive. She knew what kind of man hosted events like this, knew what the Bellassini name meant in Rome's complicated social geography. But she also knew that declining would be a different kind of complication. "Of course," she said. The security man led her across the room, past groups of guests who tracked her passage with curious eyes. She kept her chin level. She was wearing a deep navy dress, modest, elegant, the kind of thing she always chose carefully because presentation was a form of respect. Her chestnut hair was pinned back at the sides and fell loose at her shoulders. Her heels were low enough that she could walk gracefully without thinking about it. Matteo Bellassini was waiting near the piano, which she found oddly appropriate. Up close, he was more striking than she had registered from across the room. The neck tattoo was visible in the open collar of his shirt. A crowned serpent and Roman cross rendered in precise black and gray shading, smoke curling toward his jaw. His hands, clasped loosely in front of him, showed the knuckle tattoos. Fidel on the right, Ite with grave on the left. Fidelita, loyalty. She had studied enough art history to read the symbolism, and she filed it away with the careful, observational part of her mind that catalogued everything. His eyes, though, up close, they were remarkable, not cold exactly, but controlled in a way that suggested coldness was a choice, not a natural state. "You changed the program," he said, not a question. His voice was low, unhurried. Italian accented English, precise and deliberate. Celeste blinked. "Excuse me?" "The last piece. It wasn't on the program the event coordinator submitted." He tilted his head slightly. "It also wasn't by anyone I recognized, which is unusual." She held very still. "I composed it myself." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, barely perceptible, but she was trained to notice subtle changes in things. Musicians had to be. "What is it called?" "It doesn't have a title yet." He was quiet for a moment. The room moved around them. He didn't seem to notice it. "It should," he said finally. "It deserves a name." She didn't know what to do with that. "Thank you for having me tonight," she said, reaching for the safe, professional register. "It was an honor." "I'd like to hire you again," he said. "Not for an event. I have a private music room here. I'd like weekly sessions. Piano. I'll pay triple your current rate." The number he named when she didn't immediately respond was, in fact, triple her current rate. She knew she should say she needed to check her schedule. She knew she should go home and think about it and talk to Gianna and be practical and sensible and careful. "All right," she said instead. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "Tuesday," he said. 7 o'clock. She nodded. He didn't say goodbye. He simply turned back to the room, and the crowd subtly reconfigured around him like water around stone, and Celeste stood next to the piano that had started all of this, thinking that she had just made a decision she didn't fully understand. The music room at Villa Serena was the most beautiful space Celeste had ever been in. She understood immediately, standing in the doorway on that first Tuesday evening, that whoever had designed this room had understood music on a level that went beyond decoration. The acoustics were engineered. The walls were lined with something that softened echo without deadening sound. 2 tall windows faced west, and the evening light fell across the Bosendorfer Imperial grand piano at the room's center in a way that made it look like a living thing. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Is something wrong? Matteo Bellassini was seated in one of the 2 chairs near the window, watching her with those gray eyes, a glass of something dark on the low table beside him. He was dressed casually compared to the gala. Dark trousers, a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, the full sleeve tattoos on both arms visible now, angel statue and rosary beads on the left forearm, Roman numeral clock and roses on the right. He wore them the way other men wore watches, as simple facts of himself. Nothing's wrong, Celeste said, moving into the room properly. I'm just taking it in. Take all the time you need. She walked to the piano. She set her bag down, removed her jacket, sat on the bench, and placed her hands on the keys without pressing them. She did this the same way every session with every piano, a moment of introduction, of asking permission, of feeling the instrument before playing it. It was a habit so ingrained she barely registered it. What are you doing? He asked. Saying hello, she said. Another of those barely perceptible expression shifts. To the piano. To every piano. They're all different. You have to listen before you play. He was quiet for a moment. Show me. She played for 90 minutes. He listened for all of it without speaking, without moving much, without looking at anything except her. She felt his attention the way she sometimes felt, whether not dramatically but as a constant ambient pressure, a change in the atmosphere of the space. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was what surprised her. It should have been uncomfortable, being watched that intently by a man she barely knew. But there was nothing predatory in how he watched. It was more like the way you watched something you were afraid might disappear. When she finished, he said, "The piece without a title. You didn't play it tonight." "No." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, arranging her sheet music. "That piece isn't for performance yet." "What is it for?" She looked at him. "It's for practicing being honest." He held her gaze. "How does a piece of music do that? You play it and it forces you to mean it. Every note. You can't hide inside it the way you can hide inside someone else's music." She looked back at the keys. "I wrote it during a difficult period. Playing it is like reading your own diary out loud. You have to decide to do it." He didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally looked up, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read at all. "Same time next Tuesday?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "And Celeste." She paused. "That piece, when you're ready. I'd like to hear it." She nodded once and left. In the car on the way home, she realized she had never told him her first name. He had simply known it. And instead of unsettling her, that awareness had arrived with a warmth she couldn't quite explain. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Tuesdays at 7. 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. She played. He listened. Gradually, they began to talk. Before and after, sometimes during a break when she would accept the tea that appeared without her asking, and he would move from the chair to lean against the window frame and ask her questions with the patient focus of someone who had decided to learn something completely. He asked about music theory. He asked about her teachers, her training, the conservatory years in Milan. He asked about her repertoire choices and what they meant to her. He never asked about her personal life directly. He circled it the way careful people circle things that matter. She asked him almost nothing. This was partly instinct and partly self-protection. She knew enough about the Bellassini family from Gianna's warnings and from the general cultural vocabulary of Rome to understand that asking Matteo Bellassini about his work was not the same as asking a banker about his portfolio. There were rooms in his life she was not equipped to enter. But she watched him the way he watched her. She noticed that he was quieter than she had expected. That when he did speak, the words were chosen carefully. Not evasively, but precisely the way a person speaks when they have learned that careless words are expensive. She noticed that he held tension in his shoulders even when everything else about him was still, that he checked his phone with a controlled regularity that suggested obligation rather than distraction, and then put it away and gave her his complete attention as though the phone's world and this room's world were two entirely separate countries. She noticed that he smiled very rarely, but when he did briefly, usually in response to something she said that surprised him, it changed his face completely. She was careful not to think about that too much. For weeks in, something shifted. She arrived on a Tuesday to find him already at the piano bench. Not playing, just sitting there with his hands resting on the closed fallboard, looking at something she couldn't see. He looked up when she came in, and for just a moment, before the control reasserted itself, he looked tired. Not physically. Something deeper than that. "I can come back another time," she said. "No." He stood immediately, moved to his chair. "I'm sorry. I was distracted. You don't have to apologize. I'm told I do it too rarely." A pause. "Please sit. Play." She sat. She played. But halfway through the second piece, she stopped. He looked at her. "What happened today?" she asked. "Nothing that concerns you." "I know." She turned on the bench to face him properly. "I'm not asking because I need to know. I'm asking because you listened to me play my most personal music for 4 weeks and you've never asked me for anything except that. So I'm asking." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long time with those gray eyes, and she had the sense of something enormous being considered behind them. A calculation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the simple, terrifying question of whether to trust. "Someone I was responsible for was hurt today," he said finally. "He'll be all right, but he might not have been." "I'm sorry," she said, simply, without filling the space with more words. He nodded once, and the tension in his shoulders released the smallest fraction. She turned back to the piano and played something different than she had planned. Something slower, something that had room in it for weight. She didn't name what she was doing. She simply did it. When she finished and looked back, he was watching her with an expression she had no word for yet. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "Musicians learn to listen to what people actually need," she said. "Not what they say they need. What the silence is asking for." He stared at her for a long moment. "Celeste," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something being handled with extraordinary care. "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." She waited. "Why do you trust me?" he said. "You know what I am, what this family is. You are not naive, I can tell. So why do you come here every week and look at me like—" He paused. "Like I'm not what everyone else sees." She considered this carefully. "Because in this room," she said, "you're not what everyone else sees. You're just someone listening to music." She picked up her bag. "People are allowed to be more than one thing." She left. She was 3 blocks from the villa before she let herself exhale fully. It was Gianna who first said the thing Celeste was trying not to think. "You're falling for him." They were at Celeste's apartment, small and warm, sheet music covering half the kitchen table, the remains of dinner pushed to one end. Gianna had that particular expression she wore when she had decided to say something honest, even if it was unwelcome. "I'm not," Celeste said. "You talk about the sessions every week. You talked about them tonight for 40 minutes. You talked about the way he listens, the way he asked you about Debussy, the way he's a client." "He's Matteo Bellassini," Gianna said quietly. "Celeste, I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because I love you. That world is dangerous. Not in a romantic story way, in a real way." "I know." "Do you?" "Yes." Celeste set down her fork. "I know exactly what he is, Gianna. I'm not confused about it. I'm just—" She stopped. "What?" "I've never met anyone who listened to me the way he does," she said finally, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Not to the music. To me. When I talk, he actually hears what I say. Not what he wants me to be saying. What I'm actually saying." Gianna was quiet for a moment. Then, "Just be careful." "I'm always careful," Celeste said, which was true, which was, in fact, the whole problem. The night of the balcony, the night of the question, came at the end of the 6th week. There was a private dinner at the villa. Not a formal event, not a gala, something smaller and more exclusive, perhaps 30 guests, people whose names moved the city in quiet ways. Mateo had extended the invitation to Celeste in the most Mateo way possible. A brief message from his assistant, formally worded, requesting her attendance without actually using the word invitation. It read more like a pleasant order. She almost didn't go. She went. She wore deep burgundy, an elegant wrap dress that moved when she walked, modest and beautiful in equal measure, her chestnut hair down and brushed to a warm shine. She arrived to find the villa transformed into something intimate and golden, candlelight on every surface, the scent of the garden drifting through the open terrace doors. Mateo found her within 7 minutes of her arrival. She suspected he had been watching for her, but she didn't say so. "You came," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that made the surrounding room feel very distant. "You asked me to," she said. "I ask many people. Most of them come because they're afraid not to." "I know," she said. "That's not why I came." He looked at her steadily. "Why then?" She smiled, small, genuine. "Because I wanted to." Something in his gray eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "Come," he said. "Let me introduce you to someone more interesting than most of the room." He steered her through the evening with a controlled deliberateness she gradually recognized as protection. Keeping her near him, positioned so that her back was never to the room, introducing her to the 2 or 3 people he actually trusted and smoothly redirecting conversations whenever they veered toward territory that would make her uncomfortable. She noticed all of it. She didn't comment on it, but she felt it. Warm and strange and new, someone arranging themselves between her and the world without being asked. The trouble arrived in the form of a woman named Viviana Ricci. Celeste noticed her before she introduced herself. You couldn't really miss Viviana in a room. She was spectacular in a studied, surgical way, dressed in a gown that declared wealth and intention simultaneously, dark hair cascading over one shoulder, eyes sharp as cut glass. She moved toward Mateo with the confidence of someone who had occupied that space before. "Mateo." Her hand went to his arm, lingered there with familiarity. "You've been hiding all evening." "I've been occupied," he said. His voice didn't change. Viviana's gaze moved to Celeste with the particular evaluating attention of someone who has just encountered unexpected competition. "And who is this?" "Celeste Morelli," Mateo said. "She's a pianist." "How charming." Viviana's smile was perfect and empty. "I didn't know you'd taken up music appreciation, Mateo." "There are many things you don't know about me," he said pleasantly. Viviana laughed, touched his arm again. "Come find me later. We have things to discuss." The word things carried freight that Celeste chose not to examine. Then she moved away, a study in controlled exit. Celeste said nothing. Mateo said nothing either, but his gaze tracked to her face with a precision that suggested he was reading something there. "An old friend?" Celeste asked finally, very neutrally. "A complication," he said. "Nothing more." She nodded, turned to look at the nearest painting. Her heart was doing the unreasonable thing again, and she was carefully refusing to acknowledge it. It was an hour later that they ended up on the balcony. She had drifted there during a moment when Mateo was pulled into a conversation she correctly assessed as something she should not be near, and she stood looking out at the city with her glass of sparkling water. She didn't drink alcohol, another small fact about herself she hadn't consciously kept from him but also hadn't offered, and breathed the jasmine air and told herself to be sensible. He appeared beside her 10 minutes later. "I wondered where you'd gone," he said. "I didn't want to be underfoot." "You are never underfoot." He said it simply, factually. He leaned against the railing beside her, facing the city, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. They were quiet together for a while. This was one of the things she had come to value about being in his presence. The silence between them was never pressured. It had weight but not urgency. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "You always ask first," she observed. "I believe in asking permission for things that matter." He turned to look at her profile. "Why did you look so uncomfortable when Viviana touched my arm?" Her chest tightened. "I didn't look uncomfortable." "Celeste." She turned to face him. "You noticed too much." "Yes," he agreed without apology. Answer the question. She was quiet for a moment, looked back at the city, chose honesty the way she chose it in music when the piece demanded it. Because she touched you like she had done it before, she said. Like she knew she could. And I noticed that I cared about that. And I'm not sure I'm supposed to. The silence that followed was different from their usual silence. Why not supposed to? He asked quietly. Because this, she gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the villa, at the entire complicated reality of who he was, is not something I know how to navigate. I don't have experience with. She stopped. With? He prompted. She shook her head slightly. I'm not someone who has had a lot of this, any of this. She was flushing now. She could feel it, the warmth climbing her neck. I haven't been in relationships, Matteo. I haven't been in the situations where I'm supposed to know how to feel about someone's arm being touched. He was quiet for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was very careful. What do you mean, you haven't been in relationships? She laughed slightly, a soft embarrassed sound. Exactly what it sounds like. I'm 26 and I've spent the last 8 years in conservatories and teaching studios and very small circles. I watched everyone around me in toxic situations and decided I didn't want any situation rather than a bad one. And the years passed, and she turned to look at him, found his gray eyes already on her, and said the rest of it quietly. I've never really let anyone close. I've never been. She stopped, looked away, said it anyway to the city lights. I've never been touched. Not by anyone. Not really. The silence that followed was enormous. It lasted long enough that she finally looked back at him. Matteo Bellassini had gone completely still. Not the controlled stillness she was used to from him. Not the strategic, deliberate immobility of a man who chose every movement. This was something different. This was the stillness of a person who has encountered something that has short-circuited every practiced response, who has been stripped of the armor of experience and left standing in something raw and unexpected. He was staring at her. You've never been touched? The words came out low, barely more than breath, and his gray eyes moved over her face with something she had never seen in them before. Something that was not desire, not triumph, not any of the things she might have feared. What she saw was something closer to reverence. Something that looked impossibly like grief. A sudden, intimate grief for every moment before this one that had not been what it should have been for her. No, she said quietly. His jaw tightened. His hand, resting on the railing, flexed once. Celeste, he said, and her name in his voice was something entirely new. Something that sounded like a vow being made before the words existed to contain it. She watched his face. Something enormous was moving behind those gray eyes. Something that was rearranging itself, that was measuring and discarding and starting over with entirely different materials. You're not, he started. Stopped. His head dropped forward slightly. He looked at the railing. When he looked back up, his expression had changed in a way she couldn't fully name, but the closest she could get to it was opened, like a window that had always been latched from the inside. No one has ever, he said, and stopped again. Matteo, you've been here, he said almost to himself, in this world, in this city, and no one. He stopped a third time, and she watched him close his eyes briefly, something happening in him that he was not stopping. She reached out, without thinking about it, and touched his hand on the railing, just her fingers over his knuckles, the lightest possible contact. He looked down at her hand on his. He looked up at her face, and Matteo Bellassini, a man who had never been caught off guard by anything in 17 years of running the most feared criminal empire in Rome, looked at her with gray eyes that were suddenly, catastrophically unguarded. No one is ever going to make you feel like that was wrong, he said. What you just told me. No one is going to make you feel like that's something to apologize for. Her throat tightened. I'm not apologizing. I know. His hand turned slowly beneath hers, and his fingers wrapped around hers. Gently, so gently it almost wasn't happening. I'm just saying. His voice was rough at the edges. I'm just saying that whoever you give that to, whoever you eventually decide is worth that, they'd better know what they're holding. She looked at him, The city blinked below them. Somewhere inside the villa, Viviana Ricci was looking for him. Somewhere in the city, things moved in the dark the way things always moved, the machinery of his empire, the weight of what he was. But here, on this balcony, with her hand in his and his gray eyes on her face and something irrevocable happening in the space between them, here, everything else ceased to matter. "Matteo," she said quietly, "what are you saying?" He looked at her for a long, long moment, and before he could answer, before whatever was building in him could break the surface and become words, become something she could hold and examine and respond to, the door behind them opened and his right-hand man, Marco, appeared with the expression he reserved for urgent things, and the world crashed back in. Matteo's hand released hers in an instant. His face closed. The armor returned in a single breath, so fast it was almost frightening, that transformation from open to sealed. "I need 2 minutes," he said to Marco. His voice was controlled again. Every inch of it. Marco's eyes moved to Celeste and back to Matteo with something in them that wasn't surprise. Exactly. Something more like recognition. "There's a situation," he said quietly. "Lorenzo Vitali's people are outside." The name landed in the air differently than anything else had all evening. Matteo's jaw set. "Get her inside," he said. "Not her. Not Celeste. Her." And the way he said it, low, quiet, immediate, told her that this was not a suggestion and not a request. "Matteo," she started. "Please," he said, turning to her. And the please was the most unguarded word she had heard from him in 6 weeks. "Please go inside with Marco. Stay with him. Don't go anywhere alone." "What's happening?" His gray eyes held hers for exactly 1 second. In that second, she saw everything, the fear he wasn't calling fear, the something enormous that had been building all evening, the weight of a man who had just found the only thing in his life that felt worth protecting and had simultaneously realized that finding it had made it a target. "I'll explain everything," he said. "I promise." She nodded. Marco led her inside, and she stood in the warm golden interior of the villa with her heart hammering and her hands still warm from his grip, watching through the tall glass doors as Matteo Bellassini stood on the balcony alone, on the phone, his face returning to stone, and understood, with a clarity that was almost musical in its precision, that whatever had just begun between them on that balcony would cost them both more than she had imagined. The question was whether they were willing to pay it. She stood at the glass, and she didn't walk away. Marco positioned himself near the doorway with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years making security look like presence rather than surveillance. He didn't hover. He simply existed in the room as a guarantee, which Celeste suspected was the best she could expect tonight. She accepted a glass of water from a passing server and moved toward the edge of the room, letting the warmth and the candlelight and the murmur of 30 carefully curated guests wash around her without touching her. Her mind was still on the balcony, on the way his hand had turned beneath hers, on the exact texture of that silence, the way Matteo's face had looked in the moment before Marco arrived, open and rearranged and quietly devastated in a way she didn't have a name for yet. Lorenzo Vitali. She didn't know the name, but she understood what it represented from the way Marco had said it, the controlled urgency, the immediate recalibration of the room's energy. Someone was at the edge of Matteo's world, and that someone had chosen tonight, and the timing was not coincidental. Viviana appeared at her elbow at precisely the wrong moment. "He's not coming back for a while," she said conversationally, as though they had been mid-discussion. She was looking at the balcony doors with an expression Celeste couldn't quite categorize. Not unkind, but not warm either. Informed, perhaps. The expression of someone who has studied the map of this particular territory. "I'm fine waiting," Celeste said. "Are you?" Viviana tilted her head slightly. The sharp-cut eyes moved over Celeste's face with the same appraising intelligence she displayed earlier, but something in it had shifted, less competitive now, more curious. "You know, you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more strategic." Viviana looked at her glass. "When I heard he had a woman coming regularly to the villa, weekly sessions, private room, no official title, I assumed." She shrugged elegantly. "But you're not. Are you?" "Not what?" "Not here for what most people are here for when it comes to Matteo." She looked at Celeste directly. You actually care about him. Celeste said nothing. That's dangerous, Viviana said. And for the first time her voice carried something that was almost genuine. Something that sounded like a warning delivered from experience. Not because he's a bad man. He isn't, not in the ways that matter. But because caring about him makes you visible in circles where visibility is very much not your friend. I understand that, Celeste said quietly. Viviana studied her for another moment. Then she nodded, a single decisive nod, as though she had reached a conclusion. Don't let him convince you that he can protect you from everything, she said. He will believe it, and he will mean it, and he will be almost right. The almost is what you need to watch. She moved away before Celeste could respond. Celeste looked at the balcony doors. Mateo was still outside, still on the phone, his back to the glass. The city lights made him look like a figure in a painting, precise, defined, surrounded by the dark. The almost, she thought. Watch the almost. He returned 40 minutes later. The party had thinned by then. Guests had moved to the outer rooms, to the garden, some departing entirely. Celeste had stayed where Marco could see her and let the time pass the way she sometimes let difficult pieces pass during practice. Not fighting it, just moving through. Mateo found her at the corner of the salon, where one of the tall windows looked out toward the eastern gardens. He came to stand beside her, and she could feel immediately that something had changed in the 40 minutes. Something had been handled, contained, resolved in whatever way these things got resolved in his world. The urgency was gone from the air around him. What remained was something quieter and more personal. Are you all right? He asked. Yes. Are you? A brief pause. Yes. Lorenzo Vitali, she said. Not a question. He turned to look at her. His expression was careful. You heard the name. Marco said it in front of me. He shouldn't have. He looked at the window. Vitali is a rival. Someone who makes periodic attempts to remind me that he exists. Tonight's visit was a message, not an action. It's been addressed. She nodded. Viviana warned me, she said, about being visible, about caring about you. He was very still for a moment. Then, what exactly did she say? She said caring about you makes me visible in dangerous circles, and that you'll believe you can protect me from everything, and you'll be almost right, and I need to watch the almost. The muscle in his jaw moved once. Viviana has strong opinions for someone who left 3 years ago. Were they wrong opinions? He looked at her. No, he said, and something in the directness of it, the refusal to deflect or minimize, made her chest ache slightly. They weren't wrong. She held his gaze. Then what does that mean? For the balcony. For whatever was happening before Marco came. It means, he said, his voice low and precise, that I need to be honest with you about what I can and cannot offer, and what being near me costs. You should have thought about that 6 weeks ago, she said quietly. I know. His jaw tightened. I was selfish. Or honest. She looked at the window. You kept coming back to the sessions. You kept creating reasons for me to be here. I didn't fight it, Mateo. I made my own choices. You made them without full information. Did you intentionally withhold something? A pause. No. Then I made them with the information I had, the way we all do. She turned to face him fully. I'm not a child. I know what your name means in this city. I know what the security and the careful positioning and the room with the perfect acoustics and the fact that no one in your life questions you. I know what all of it is attached to. I've known for 6 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. And you stayed anyway, he said. I stayed anyway. The silence between them was enormous and tender. Go home tonight, he said finally. Let me think about how to do this correctly. Do this? He met her eyes. Whatever this is, whatever I'm asking of you, Celeste, I want to do it correctly. That's not a thing I've ever wanted before. A pause. Give me a few days. She nodded. Marco drove her home. She sat in the back of the car and watched the city pass and knew, with the same quiet certainty she felt when a piece of music finally resolved after weeks of working at it, that nothing was going to go back to what it had been before. 3 days passed. On the second day, Her phone buzzed with a message from Mateo's private number. Not his assistant's line, not an official channel, but the number he had quietly given her 2 weeks into the sessions, framed as a practical matter of scheduling. I'm thinking about what you said, about people being allowed to be more than one thing. She stared at the message for a long time. So am I, she wrote back. On the third day, Gianna came over with coffee and the particular focused energy she deployed when she had information she had decided Celeste needed immediately. Lorenzo Vitali made a public statement this morning, Gianna said, pulling up something on her phone. At the Marchetti breakfast, that finance event very well attended. He made a comment about the Bellassini family allowing vulnerabilities. She looked up. The press is reading it as business. But people in those circles are reading it differently. Celeste's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Vulnerabilities, she said. It's the kind of language you use, Gianna said carefully, when you want to signal that you've identified something someone values, something that could be reached. Celeste set her coffee down. He means me, she said. We don't know that. He means me, Gianna. She stood up, moved to the window. The street below was ordinary. Morning light on Roman cobblestone. A woman walking a small dog. Pigeons reorganizing themselves on a windowsill. Normal life doing what normal life did. I'm the new thing. I'm the thing Mateo hasn't had before. And someone has noticed. Gianna was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Celeste thought about the balcony. About Mateo's hand closed gently around hers. About the look in his gray eyes, opened, like a window that had always been latched from the inside. I'm going to go to the villa, she said. We need to talk. He met her at the door. She had sent one message coming over. Is that all right? And his reply had been simply I'll be here, and when the car brought her through the gates of Villa Serena in the late afternoon, Mateo was standing in the entrance. And the look on his face when he saw her was something she filed away in the part of herself that stored irreplaceable things. They sat in the music room, not at the piano, not in the formal seating near the window. They sat on the low, curved sofa along the far wall, close but not touching, and Celeste set her bag aside and said, Tell me about Lorenzo Vitali. His expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind it settled. The particular stillness of a person who has been bracing for a conversation and is simultaneously relieved and dreading that it has arrived. He was my father's contemporary, Mateo said. They shared certain interests until they didn't. Vitali has spent the last decade attempting to position himself as a legitimate alternative in circles that used to belong exclusively to the Bellassini name. He's strategic and he's patient, and he's been waiting for a moment of perceived weakness. And I'm the perceived weakness, she said. You are the first thing I have cared about that was not connected to power or obligation in 17 years, Mateo said, and his voice was absolutely steady, which made what he was saying more rather than less striking. Vitali is very good at identifying what matters to people. It's one of his primary tools. Celeste held his gaze. Does this change how you feel about me being involved in your life? No. It should probably. I know what it should probably do, he said. And I sat with that for 3 days. What it actually does is... He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. It makes me want to be more certain. Not less. More certain of what? He turned to look at her fully. That you're not simply a passing vulnerability. That what's between us is something that deserves to be guarded rather than discarded. Her chest was very tight. Mateo, what are you saying to me? I'm saying, he said slowly, like a man who has chosen every word in advance and is still afraid of what they cost, that I have spent 6 weeks in this room with you and I have understood more about myself in those 6 weeks than in the previous 36 years. I'm saying that when Marco interrupted us on the balcony, the first thing I felt was not the danger of Vitali's people at the gate. It was grief, that I didn't get to finish what I was saying to you. Her eyes were beginning to sting. She blinked. I'm saying that what you told me, about never having been touched, about choosing carefully, about deciding to wait for something real rather than settle for something easy. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, Celeste, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I already suspected. What did it confirm? He looked at her with those gray eyes that had been locked and were no longer. "That you are the most careful person I have ever met," he said quietly. "And careful people don't make mistakes lightly. If you're here in this room, looking at me like that, then whatever this is, it is not nothing. And I would rather—" His voice dropped to something rougher. "I would rather do this correctly, slowly, with every possible honesty between us, than rush it and break something that I cannot replace." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does correctly look like? In your world. That's what I'd like to figure out. With you." He held her gaze. "If you're willing." She looked at him. This complicated, guarded, unexpectedly tender man who had sat across from her for 6 weeks and listened with his whole self and asked permission before every significant thing and looked at her in the night air like she was something that deserved to be handled with extraordinary care. "I'm willing," she said. Something in his shoulders released. "There are things I need to do to make you safe," he said, his voice shifting back to its functional register. Still warm, but purposeful now. "Vitaly needs to understand that a threat to you is not a useful leverage point. He needs to understand this in the way people in his position understand things, clearly and without ambiguity. I don't want people hurt because of me. No one will be hurt." He looked at her directly. "Vitaly respects a clear line. I've never given him one because there was never a line to draw. Now there is." A pause. "You." She absorbed this. "Also," he said, and something flickered in his expression that she recognized after a moment as discomfort. The particular discomfort of a man who is about to say something he doesn't know how to say strategically. "I want to ask you something that may be too much." "Ask." "I'd like you to move temporarily into the guest wing," he said. "Not." He paused, clearly anticipating the response. "Not for any reason other than security. Vitaly's people appeared at the gate 3 days ago. Your apartment building has no security. Your daily routes are observable. I would feel—" "You would feel," she prompted. He looked at her steadily. "I would feel considerably less insane," he said. "If I knew you were somewhere I could keep you safe." She considered it. She thought about what Viviana had said. "You'll believe he can protect you from everything, and he'll be almost right." She thought about Gianna's face this morning, carefully not panicking on her behalf. She thought about the cobblestones below her apartment window and how a woman with a dog had looked like something normal, and how normal had just become a more complicated concept. "Separate wing?" she said. "Your own rooms. Your own key. Come and go completely freely. My piano practice. The music room is yours whenever you want it. There's a second instrument in the east wing as well." The slightest hesitation. "I had it tuned last week." She stared at him. "Last week." "I was being optimistic," he said, and the dry self-awareness in it almost made her laugh. "Almost. A week's trial," she said. "And we reassess." He nodded. "And Matteo?" "Yes. When this is handled, Vitaly, all of it, we talk about what comes after. What this looks like when I'm not here for safety reasons." "Yes," he said, and the word was a vow before the vow existed. She went home, packed a careful bag, called Gianna, who reacted with approximately the level of complex emotion Celeste had anticipated, and arrived back at Villa Serena that evening. The guest wing was beautiful. Her rooms were warm and quiet, and someone had put fresh flowers on the writing desk, and she didn't ask who had arranged that because she already knew. She sat at the second piano in the east wing for 2 hours that first night. It was a Yamaha Grand, smaller than the Bosendorfer in the music room, but perfectly tuned, warm in tone. She played through her practice pieces. Then she played the piece without a title, and she played it the way she only ever played it alone, with everything in it, every note meaning exactly what it was supposed to mean. When she stopped, she realized there was light under the door. She hadn't been alone. She opened the door. The hallway was empty, but in the darkness down toward the main corridor, she could just see the shadow of someone walking away. Unhurried, quiet, deliberate. She went back inside. She pressed her hand to her chest where her heart was doing the unreasonable thing. She named the piece finally in her head. She called it First and Last. The days at the villa were not what she had expected. She had anticipated awkwardness, the strange compressed reality of proximity, of sharing space with a man she was in the careful early stages of something important with. She had anticipated having to navigate household rhythms and security schedules and the general machinery of a large estate. What she had not anticipated was how natural it felt. Matteo was an early riser. She usually was too, but he was up and working by 5:30, already fielding calls and communications in his private office when she appeared in the kitchen at 7 with her hair undone and her expression still half in sleep. The first morning, she found coffee made, strong, Italian, exactly the temperature she would have made it herself, and a brief handwritten note on the counter. "Good morning. There is also tea if you prefer. The garden is worth seeing at this hour. M." She took her coffee to the garden. He found her there 40 minutes later, when whatever crisis had occupied his early morning had been dealt with, and they sat on the low stone bench near the fountain and didn't say much, and it was, she thought, one of the better 40 minutes she had spent in recent memory. This became a pattern. Morning garden. Evening dinner, usually just the two of them, sometimes Marco was present, occasionally one of the household staff. Piano in the afternoon. Conversations that began simply and became, gradually, the kind of conversation she had never had with anyone. Conversations about what they believed, what they had survived, what they wanted from the years remaining to them. He told her about his father, not much but enough. The way the Bellassini Empire had been inherited rather than chosen. The way being 17 years old and already expected to carry something enormous had hollowed out the space where a different kind of self might have grown. She told him about her mother. About the years watching love curdle into control and then into silence in the household she had grown up in, and how she had decided at 13 that she would rather be alone than replicate that. How the piano had become the relationship that never disappointed, that required honesty and returned honesty and never asked her to be smaller than she was. "The piano is the reason you're still whole," he said one evening. She looked at him. "What? You channeled everything into something that kept you intact," he said simply. "Everything you couldn't trust people with, you put into the music. It preserved you." She was quiet for a moment. "That's the most accurate thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. He looked at her with gray eyes that were learning to show things they hadn't shown before. "I want to be something that keeps you intact," he said. "Not something that chips away at you." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The same gesture from the balcony, but deliberate now, chosen, not impulsive. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat like that for the rest of dinner. The situation with Vitali escalated on the 8th day. Celeste was in the music room when Marco came to find her. Not urgently, but with the focused calm of someone delivering information that needed to be received calmly. "Mr. Bellassini asked me to let you know that we've identified an incident," Marco said. "Nothing immediate, but it's relevant to you directly." He paused. "Someone attempted to access information about your teaching schedule. Your studio in the city. Client list." Her stomach dropped. "Vitali, we believe so. It's been intercepted. Your studio contacts have been secured without their knowledge of the reason. There's nothing actionable at this point." Marco met her eyes. "Mr. Bellassini is handling it." "Where is he?" "He asked that you wait in the music room. He'll be with you within the hour." She waited. She didn't play. She sat at the piano bench with her hands in her lap and she thought carefully about fear. Not the panic variety, but the honest, clear-eyed variety. The fear that was telling her something true. That this was real. That whatever was between her and Matteo had real-world weight, real-world consequences, and that she had made a choice to step into it with both feet and she could not pretend otherwise. But she also thought about what she didn't feel. She didn't feel the urge to run. She was afraid, and she didn't want to leave. That, she thought, was probably the most important information she had. Matteo arrived in 43 minutes. He came in without knocking. The music room had been established, quietly, as their shared space, the one room in the villa where formality wasn't required. He stopped when he saw her on the bench, hands in her lap, watching him. "Marco told you," he said. "Yes." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the piano bench, on her left, close enough that she felt the warmth of him. He set his elbows on his knees and looked at the keys and was quiet for a moment. "Vitali is testing," he said, trying to find a useful edge. He didn't reach anything. He won't. You sound very certain. I am very certain. He turned to look at her. About this. I need you to believe me when I say this. Vitaly will not get near you. I will burn down whatever needs burning down before that happens. Matteo. I know how that sounds, he said, and something in his voice was rough. I know you don't want people hurt on your behalf. I'm not speaking of violence. I'm speaking of the kind of certainty that removes options. Vitaly needs to understand that I am not bluffing. That there is no calculation he can make that ends well for him if it involves you. She held his gaze. Have you communicated that? I've arranged a meeting. Tomorrow. He looked at her steadily. I want to tell you something before that meeting. Something I want you to have before anything else happens. She waited. He turned toward her on the bench. He looked at her with a directness so total that she felt the full weight of his attention like something physical. Not pressing, not threatening. Just complete. I've been careful my entire life, he said. About everything. Every word, every association, every risk. I have not allowed myself something that I could not afford to lose, because in this life, the things you love are the things that can be taken. His jaw worked. I have been careful about you. Careful about how much I let you matter. I have sat in this room with you for 6 weeks and been very careful. He paused. I'm not going to be careful anymore. Her heart was very loud. What does that mean? She asked. It means that tomorrow, in that meeting, Lorenzo Vitali will understand that you are not a vulnerability. You are not a weakness. You are not something that can be reached to destabilize me. His gray eyes held hers. You are the reason I hold the line at all. The reason every vow I've ever made to this family means something. Because now there is something worth upholding them for. She felt tears building somewhere behind her eyes. Matteo, she said softly. I'm not finished, he said, and something in his voice shifted lower, more private. I haven't said the specific thing. She waited. I have spent 36 years not knowing what I was building toward, he said. I thought it was the empire, the name, the continuation of something my father started. I was wrong about what it was for. He looked at her hands on her lap, then back at her face. I was building toward you. I don't know if that's rational. I don't know if I have the right to say it yet. But you told me the truth on the balcony when you didn't have to, and you stayed when you could have left, and you looked at me like I was allowed to be more than one thing, and... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. I love you, Celeste. The silence was total. Her hands trembled slightly. I'm not asking for anything right now, he said carefully. I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm not asking you to promise something you're not ready for. He shook his head slightly, something almost helpless in it. I needed you to have that. Before tomorrow. Whatever happens. She looked at him for a long, long moment. She thought about careful people. About choosing to wait for something real. About the peace she had named first and last in a quiet room while his shadow moved away down the hall. I'm not good at saying things first, she said. I've never been. I process through music, through silence, through watching and waiting until I'm certain. Her voice was very steady. So I'm going to tell you what I've been certain of for about 3 weeks, even though it took me this long to say it. She held his gaze. I love you too. I've loved you since the night you asked me why I trusted you, and you looked genuinely confused that someone did. He closed his eyes for one moment. When he opened them, there was nothing guarded in them at all. For the first time, in this room, in this life, Matteo Bellassini's face was completely open. He reached up and touched her face. One hand carefully, his thumb tracing her cheek with a gentleness so absolute that her breath caught. He held her like something rare and irreplaceable. She leaned into his hand. They sat like that for a long time, in the room where she had played her most honest music, in the room where he had learned to be more than one thing. Outside, the city moved in its complicated ways. Tomorrow would have its own weight, but this moment belonged only to them. The meeting with Lorenzo Vitali took place the following afternoon at a neutral location. A private dining room in a hotel that existed precisely for conversations like this one. Celeste was not present. She sat in the music room and played through her whole repertoire, starting from the beginning, all the way to the end, and she did not let herself catastrophize. Marco brought her the report 2 hours later. It went cleanly, he said. Mr. Vitali received the message. His position is understood. A pause. He won't be a problem. Celeste nodded. Is Matteo all right? Something in Marco's expression shifted. Not much, just a fractional softening of the professional mask. He's fine. He'll be back within the hour. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, looking at a point past her shoulder. In 15 years of working for him, I have never seen him the way he's been this past month. Whatever you've done. He stopped, apparently reaching the outer limit of what he was comfortable saying. He's better, he said simply. That's all. He left. Celeste turned back to the piano and played the piece she had written during the difficult time, the one without the title that had since been privately named. She played it all the way through, and she meant every note, and it sounded different than it ever had before. It sounded like an answer. The weeks that followed were the quietest Celeste had known in years. Not quiet in the sense of empty. The villa was never empty. Matteo's world was never still. There were always things moving in the city, and Marco's careful updates and the occasional presence of Bellassini associates who came and went with their own gravity. But quiet in the way that mattered, internally. The constant low-level vigilance she had carried for most of her adult life, the watchfulness, the guardedness, the careful emotional rationing, had begun gradually to release. She moved back to her apartment at the 2-week mark. Matteo drove her himself, which was not the kind of thing Matteo Bellassini typically did, and he carried her bag up to her floor and stood in her small, music-filled, sheet music-covered living room and looked at it with gray eyes that were trying to memorize something. It's very like you, he said. Is it? It's precise and warm and full of things that require patience to understand. He looked at her. I like it. She smiled. You can visit, you know? I know. He set the bag down carefully. Looked at her. Celeste, I want to ask you something. You always ask first. Yes, he agreed. Can I take you somewhere? This weekend. Not a gala, not an event. Just somewhere I want to show you. She considered him. This man who had shifted the geography of her whole emotional interior in a matter of weeks. Who had asked permission at every door and never pushed through one she wasn't ready to open. Where? She asked. The coast. There's a house. It was my grandfather's before it was mine. I haven't been in 3 years. A pause. I'd like to go back with you. She held his gaze. Understood the weight of what he was saying. Not just let me take you on a trip, but let me take you to the place where I'm only one thing, not many, and let you see it. Yes, she said. He exhaled, almost imperceptibly, the smallest release of something held. Saturday, he said. She nodded. He said goodbye at the door. He paused before he left and looked back at her. The briefest look, tender and private and new, and then he was gone. She closed the door and pressed her back against it and smiled at her ceiling for a long, indulgent moment. The house on the coast was a weathered stone villa above the Amalfi coastline. Not grand, not carefully decorated. It was old in the comfortable way, worn tiles, salt-roughed windowsills, rooms that smelled of the sea and of time, a terrace that looked out over water so blue it seemed implausible, a garden that had been left to do largely what it wanted, bougainvillea scaling the walls in cheerful disorder. Celeste stood on the terrace the morning after their arrival and felt the sea wind move through her hair and understood why he hadn't come back in 3 years. Some places are too honest for an unready person. My grandfather brought me here when I was 8, Matteo said behind her. He came to stand beside her at the railing, a cup of coffee in each hand. He offered her one. She took it. They leaned against the railing together and looked at the water. For 2 weeks every summer, he was the only person in the family who ever asked me what I wanted to do. Not what I would do, what I wanted. What did you want? She asked. I wanted to learn to sail, he said. I wanted a dog. I wanted a brief pause, something almost rueful in his expression. I wanted to be somewhere I didn't have to be a Bellassini. She looked at him. And now, he looked at her sidelong. Now I'm somewhere I don't have to be a Bellassini, he said. And I have a better reason for it than just wanting to escape. He turned to face her, set his cup on the railing. You're the reason. She set her own cup down. He reached for her hands, both of them, holding them gently, looking down at them for a moment with an expression of such careful concentration that she felt the tenderness of it like something warm. I want to talk to you about something, he said, and I want to say it here because here is the only place I know how to say it simply. All right? She said softly. He looked up. His gray eyes were steady and open, and there was no performance in them. No strategy, no armor. Just Matteo, the one who existed before the empire and underneath the reputation and behind all the carefully engineered distance. I know we haven't been doing this long, he said. I know that by any reasonable measure, I should wait longer before saying this. But I've spent my entire life waiting for the correct tactical moment. And the correct tactical moment has cost me every human thing I ever almost had. He held her hands a little more firmly. So I'm not waiting. I'm asking now. And I'll understand if the answer is not yet. And I'll wait as long as you need, and none of this changes between us either way. But I need you to know that I'm asking with everything I have. Her heart was very full. Matteo, she said gently. Marry me, he said. Simply. Completely. Not for any reason that comes from my world. Not for alliance, not for protection. Not for anything except that you are the first person in my life who looked at me like I was worth more than what I carry. And I want to spend my life making sure you never regret deciding that. His voice was rough at the edges now. This controlled man with his uncontrolled feelings. And she loved him so completely in this moment that it surprised her. I want to be your first and last, Celeste. In every way. In every room. For everything. She was crying. She hadn't realized she'd started. I need to tell you something first, she said. He waited. He would always wait. I'm terrified, she said. Not of you. Of this, of how much this matters. Of how much you matter. I've spent my whole life making sure I didn't matter too much to anyone because people who matter can be broken. And I watched the people I loved get broken, and She stopped. Steadied herself. I'm scared. I want you to know that. I'm choosing this from inside the fear, not after it's gone. That's the bravest kind of choice, he said. She looked at him through swimming eyes. Yes, she said. He stilled. Yes, you're scared, or yes, you. Yes, she said again and smiled. Yes, I'll marry you. His face broke open completely. He pulled her toward him slowly, telegraphing every movement. And she went forward into his arms, and he held her with the same extraordinary care he brought to everything that mattered to him. Not crushing, not rushed, just completely present. His arms around her and her face against his chest and the sea wind moving around them both. And she could feel his heartbeat, fast and unsteady. This carefully controlled man completely uncontrolled at last. I will not waste this, he said into her hair. I promise you. Every day. I know, she said. And she did. They returned to Rome on Sunday evening. On Monday, Matteo called a family meeting, the senior members of the Bellassini circle, the elder advisors, the inner council. He stood in the formal meeting room of the villa and told them that Celeste Morelli was going to be his wife. He told them this not as a request and not as a question but as a statement of fact, with the same quiet authority that had held the family structure for a decade. There was a silence. Then his uncle, the elder family figure who had warned him weeks earlier about the dangers of attachment, who had watched Matteo's emotional landscape with the careful concern of a man who understood what that family history cost, cleared his throat. She's a pianist, he said. Yes. Not connected to any of the families. No. His uncle was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Matteo with old, tired eyes that had seen everything and were not surprised by much anymore. You look different, he said simply. I am different, Matteo said. His uncle nodded once. Then bring her to dinner, he said. Properly. Let us meet her. Marco came to Celeste's apartment the following day. She opened the door expecting a delivery and found him standing there with a small package wrapped in paper and an expression that was the closest she had seen to sheepish on his particular face. Mr. Bellassini asked me to bring you this, he said. And to tell you, he stopped, consulted something in his memory with visible effort. He said to tell you that this belonged to his grandmother, and she was the only woman in the family's history who made his grandfather stop being a Bellassini and simply be himself. And he thought you should have it. He offered the package. She took it. Inside was a small box of old velvet, and inside the box was a ring, not elaborate, not showy. A single oval stone, deep blue, set in worn gold, clearly old, clearly beloved and worn and passed through decades. Simple, completely sincere. She closed the box. She looked at Marco. Tell him, she said carefully, that I'll put it on tonight. Dinner. If he'd like to be there for that. Marco blinked once. Something that might have been a smile moved across his face in the brief, controlled way that Matteo's people always displayed emotion, quickly, definitively contained. I'll tell him, he said. She closed the door and sat down on the piano bench, the closest surface, and held the velvet box in her hands and breathed slowly. First and last, she thought. First and last. The dinner at Villa Serena that evening was small. Just the two of them, which she suspected was deliberate. Matteo was already there when she arrived. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the collar open enough that the neck tattoo was faintly visible, and he stood when she came into the dining room with the gravity of someone who understands that certain moments deserve to be stood for. She sat across from him. They talked through dinner, about the coast, about the week ahead, about a piece she was working on for a student recital in November. About small things, comfortable things, the ordinary fabric of two people who have decided to build something together. When dessert was cleared, she reached into her bag and took out the velvet box. She opened it. She looked at him across the table. Will you? She said. He stood. He came around the table to her. He took the ring from the box with hands that were not quite steady, a fact she noticed and treasured, and he slid it onto her finger with the careful deliberateness of a man for whom this gesture was the most significant one he had ever made. The ring fit as though it had been waiting. He didn't let go of her hand. He stood over her with his gray eyes on the ring for a long moment. Then he looked up. I have never in my life, he said quietly, been given something I was afraid to lose. And now, she said softly. Now I have you, he said. And I understand what it means to have something worth every fear. She stood from the chair. He pulled her close in one smooth, careful motion, and she went, and he held her the way you hold something irreplaceable. Outside the windows of Villa Serena, the city moved and breathed and did its complicated human work. Somewhere, the machinery of the Bellassini Empire continued its perpetual motion. Somewhere, the city's power structures arranged and rearranged themselves around the unmovable fact of Matteo's authority, his reputation, his name. But in this room, in this specific warm light, there was only a woman who had given her whole heart to music because nothing else had seemed safe enough, and a man who had built his entire life around control because nothing had ever felt worth surrendering it for. And now they had found each other, and the surrender for both of them was complete. The engagement moved through Rome's complicated social world in the way that significant things do, quietly at first, then all at once. It was Matteo who insisted on the formal announcement, surprising everyone including Marco, who confessed to Celeste privately that he had never seen Matteo voluntarily make anything about his personal life public. He's proud of you, Marco said, in the tone of someone reporting something extraordinary. I want you to understand. That's not something I've observed before. In 15 years. Viviana Ricci sent a card. Handwritten, brief, you were exactly what he needed. I knew it the night I saw him watching you at the piano. Take care of each other. V. Celeste kept the card. Gianna cried for approximately 20 minutes upon hearing the news, then made Celeste promise that she would be the one to play the piano at the wedding, then cried again when Celeste said that was exactly what she had been planning. The wedding was set for the following spring. Not grand, not by Bellassini standards, which was to say it was still beautiful, still held in the Villa Serena gardens, still attended by a carefully chosen 100 people. But it was honest. That was what Celeste had asked for, and Matteo had given her everything she asked for the same way he gave her everything. Without drama, without condition, with the focused completeness of a man who has found the one thing he will not negotiate. She wore cream. She carried gardenias. Her chestnut hair was loose because he had said, quietly, that he loved it loose, and the morning of the wedding she had let it down and kept it there. He stood at the end of the aisle in a dark suit and looked at her coming toward him with an expression that no camera fully caught and no observer fully described afterward. Something private and total and so outside his usual presentation that the people who knew him best simply stopped pretending to look elsewhere and watched openly. She walked toward him. He watched her all the way. When she reached him, he offered his hand. She took it. The ceremony was performed in the garden under late spring light, with Gianna crying at the back and Marco standing impossibly straight near the entrance and Matteo's uncle dabbing at something near his eye that he would not acknowledge, and the sound of the garden and the distant city, and somewhere inside, the Bosendorfer piano silent and waiting. When the officiant reached the vows, Matteo turned to her fully and recited his from memory. She had not known he planned to do this, had not known he had prepared them privately, and when he began she felt the familiar tears start. "I spent my life building walls I called structure," he said, his voice low and steady, "and calling distance safety and calling control strength. I was wrong about all of it. You walked into a room and played a piece of music that had no title, and you told me it was for practicing honesty. And you looked at me like I was allowed to be more than what I had made myself. I am going to spend every day we have together being worth that look. I vow to protect you not by standing between you and the world, but by standing beside you in it. I vow to listen the way you have taught me to listen, to what the silence is asking for. And I vow that you will never spend a day of your life not knowing that you are chosen. Completely, irrevocably, first and last." She had to take a breath before she could speak. She had not memorized hers. She had thought she would read from the paper she was holding, but she found, standing here with his hand in hers and his gray eyes on her face, that the words she needed were the ones she had been practicing for weeks, in the music room, in the garden mornings, in every quiet moment of the months that had led to this day. "I learned to trust music," she said, "before I could trust people, because music doesn't lie to you. It asks everything and gives everything, and the exchange is always honest. I spent a long time waiting for a person who was like that, who would ask with their whole self and listen with their whole self and be honest even when it cost them. I was beginning to think I was waiting for something that didn't exist outside of compositions." She paused. "Then you sat in a room and listened to me play a piece that was my most private thing, and you asked me what it was called. And I realized I was still learning what I was capable of trusting." Her voice was unsteady now. "I trust you, not because you're perfect and not because the world is simple, because you have shown me, consistently every day, that you will be honest when it costs you, careful when I need care, and brave enough to love me correctly even when that was harder than anything your world had asked of you before. I choose you, Matteo, in the fear, in the complicated, in the beautiful, in everything. First and last." He was holding her hands so gently. His jaw was very tight, the way it got when he was feeling things he was still learning to let show. When the officiant said the words that mattered, and they exchanged the rings, and the garden heard the official conclusion of something that had begun on a balcony on a jasmine night with a question about being touched, he kissed her. Not dramatically, not for performance. Just quietly, just the two of them in the middle of everything, just completely. The garden applauded. Somewhere in the back, Gianna was absolutely not going to recover. Later, much later, after the dinner and the toasts and the first dance that Celeste had choreographed as a small private joke by choosing a Chopin nocturne and watching Matteo recognize it immediately and laugh, a real laugh for the guests, they stood on the garden terrace as the evening wound toward night. Celeste leaned against the railing. Matteo stood beside her. The city was golden in the evening light below them. The jasmine was blooming. The stars were beginning above the rooftops. "The balcony," she said. He looked at her. "When you froze," she said. "That night when I told you. I never asked you. What were you going to say?" Before Marco interrupted, he was quiet for a moment, looking at her profile. The ring on her finger caught the last of the light. "I was going to say," he said quietly, "that whoever you gave yourself to would need to understand that they were not receiving something ordinary, that they were receiving something preserved, something that had been kept safe through great care and great patience and great love, and that receiving that was not an entitlement. It was the greatest privilege of whatever life they were living." She turned to look at him. "And then I was going to say," he continued even more quietly, that I wanted to be that person, that I wanted, more than I had ever wanted anything, to be the one you decided was worth it. The one you trusted with everything you had been protecting. Tears pricked her eyes again. You didn't say any of that, she said softly. No, he agreed. Marco came. She laughed. A small, wet, real laugh. Well, she said. You've said it now. I've said it now, he agreed. She turned back toward the city. He came to stand close behind her, and she leaned back, and his arms came around her, warm and certain, and everything she had spent 26 years waiting to believe was real. The night was jasmine and city lights and the sound of a world continuing its motion, indifferent to the small, perfect enormity of two people deciding to love each other carefully, completely, and without the protection of distance. This was what it felt like to choose. This was what it felt like to be chosen. This was what it felt like to have someone vow, quietly, entirely, with everything they were, to be your first and last. And Celeste Morelli, who had trusted music before she trusted people, closed her eyes against the shoulder of the man who had learned to listen, and let the moment settle into her like a note held perfectly. Sustained, resonant, alive. First and last, she thought. First and last. Thank you for watching. If the story moved you, if you felt even one moment of it, please like this video, share it with someone who loves stories like this one, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every share helps this channel bring you more stories about love that is worth the fear, devotion that is worth the cost, and the kind of trust that changes everything. We'll see you in the next one.